Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 94 of Highest Power Church and State. I'm Rick Pidcock, your host, and we're going to do something a little bit different today because I'm a bit under the weather, and we're actually all about to be under the weather, literally, because there's a massive ice storm coming, and I've got 7 people in my family that I need to have food and all of that stuff prepared for who knows how long, because in my area in South Carolina, from our understanding, it's basically going to be a huge ice storm, which means we could be out of power for possibly days. So I've got a lot on my plate in order to make sure that there is a lot on their plate for the time of the storm. So I am going to take this time and kind of go off script a little bit and discuss some things that have been going on, particularly with the previous 3 articles that I have written and the events that have been in the news with Minnesota. So basically, on December 30th, I sent a text to Mark Wingfield, the executive director of Baptist News, and I was thinking about where we're going to be focusing in this next year, in particular because over 2025, we had some big names in conservative evangelicalism pass away. There was John MacArthur, there was James Dobson, Voddie Baucham, there's Charlie Kirk. There were a number of really big, influential people who no longer were going to be producing content. And so then it's well, where do we focus now? Who are the people who are sacralizing these harmful power dynamics? And I told Mark that I think I'd like to spend some more attention on the Gospel Coalition and Desiring God in particular, because there's this thing that is going on in conservative circles right now. There's one group of people that are very racist and sexist in a way that's in your face. This is like John MacArthur and Doug Wilson. They're literally building cases for slavery. Slavery is the perfect scenario. Women go home. All women must submit to men. Men are the conquerors and colonizers of women. Women make the sandwiches. You can just see it in the things that they're saying. It's so overt. And yet there's this other side of conservative evangelicalism that really promotes the same power dynamics, but they do it in a way that makes it more theologically palatable. And that's what I see happening a lot in the Gospel Coalition and in Desiring God. So they still promote men over women. They still have a bunch of white men in charge. They still dismiss a lot of the racial concerns that we have with the violence that's going on. But they do it while talking about things like God's glory and our satisfaction. And they do it by having women write articles for them about how women can respond to different things like, their husbands going to seminary without ever mentioning the possibility of women going to seminary, or how women are going to therapists rather than to their pastors. And it seems more subtle because they're utilizing women. They're calling them directors and different things like that. And in doing so, a lot of conservatives miss the dynamic that is going on and how harmful it is. So in my mind, this year, I would like to begin to cut through some of those theologically palatable smokescreens and begin to show how this is causing harm in ways that we may not recognize, or a lot of people may not recognize. And a lot of people will, if you follow me on social media, sometimes they'll think that I'm being a bit too direct, a bit too negative, talking too starkly about the abuse of men like John Piper or Doug Wilson or John MacArthur or the writers for the Gospel Coalition. And I get that. I say things that are very in your face on social media. This is what these people are literally doing. And some of that can feel stark. It can feel harsh to come face to face with. But the reason why is that I'm trying to cut through their smoke screens and through all of their gobbledygook lingo that they use and their branding to show the stark reality of what is going on. There is a woman that has been abused by the pastors of City Church in Minnesota that we're hearing about, these pastors that are so amazing, supposedly, that were targeted by the protesters. But this woman that we're going to talk about a little bit later in this episode, she said in a podcast episode on the Sons of Patriarchal podcast, she said, "It's hard to weather the storms of spiritual abuse and toxicity when we're in it because we don't often see it. I look back and go, I didn't realize what I was in. And I think having outside voices, that's what helped me to see it for what it was and to stay strong when the abuse amped up. You don't see it when you're steeped in it." And so, that's kind of how I see myself. I'm outside of that world now. I was once in it. I understand how those dynamics work because I was once a man in those churches that led in those churches. And so I understand the theology. I understand the ethics and the way they frame these things as living out the gospel. And I understand where these men lack awareness and lack self-awareness of the harm they're causing. I understand where they suppress the harm that they know they're causing. And so I think I have a gift at pointing that out and for helping people cut through the glory and satisfaction stuff that kind of hides what's going on and to really see it for what it is. And that's what I'm trying to do. I hear from people all the time that say, "Oh, I've been following you for a year and now I'm like, oh wow, I'm starting to recognize, yeah, this is the water I was swimming in." That's kind of where I'm coming at with that. So I wanted to discuss these past three articles that I've done and kind of show how they're all kind of working together in exposing these men for the harm that they're causing despite how they brand themselves so carefully. And the first one, it was a piece titled, "There's a Reason More Women Seek Help from Therapists Than Pastors," and it was published by Baptist News Global on January 9th. And it was a response to an article written by a woman named Laura Kleinschmidt with the Gospel Coalition. And her Gospel Coalition bio says she's the director of women's ministries, where she assists the pastors in pastoral care and leads women's events. And her website shows photos of her speaking to an audience from behind a pulpit, but it carefully captions the photos by calling them Laura's talks recorded at women's events. Now, I know how the publishing world online works. Usually when there's a bio in a lot of these website places that you write for, usually the author is the one who wrote it. The author is the one who wrote their bio on their website. It's always kind of funny when I read someone's bio on their website because I'm like, I know you wrote this about yourself. And so it makes me a little self-conscious when I write my own. But yeah, of course, she likely wrote these words about herself, but that's the world that she lives in. Like, women in these complementarian churches, they're called directors. You look at their leadership page on their websites, the men are pastors, the women are directors or coordinators or assistants. And it's basically a way for these men to feel like they're giving women opportunities to lead because they're directing something, but they're really not pastors. They're simply assisting the pastors in pastoral care, despite the fact that they're, providing pastoral care. And I've gotten some negative feedback on this article because a few people thought I was dismissing and belittling the role of a woman being a director. And that's not at all the case. What I'm trying to do is show these dynamics, how they present women as directors. And wow, we got these women writing for our website. But what they're doing is their writing is promoting the patriarchy. And that's a problem. And so you can't just get away with being branded like you're so supportive of women because you let them talk when you're controlling them by not allowing them to call it a sermon and things like that. So within her article, she talks about the secular therapeutic culture where she thinks that people live under the authority of a therapist and argues that God is the final authority over the psychological. So she's basically contrasting living under the authority of a therapist and living under the authority of God, which of course in that conservative evangelical world is through the church, which is, overseen by pastors who are, of course, all men. And so she's not going to, in her article, explicitly go out and say, my main concern is that women be under the authority of men, because that would be like the Doug Wilson, John MacArthur, stark sexist statement. She's operating in more of this gospel coalition, desiring God type world where they're going to criticize secular therapeutic culture, talking about being under the authority of a therapist as opposed to under the authority of God. And then behind the scenes, we all know, that means in your theology, that means submitting to the church, which is run by men. And so it has the same effect. It's just, hidden a bit in terms of caring for women in the context of the church. And so people don't necessarily recognize it when that's the world and the water they're swimming in. So I'm not a therapist. I don't know the world of therapy that much, but I know enough to be suspicious about the idea of living under the authority of the therapist. To me, that felt like projecting the conservative evangelical concerns and relational dynamics onto the world of therapy. I don't think therapists really lord themselves over their clients. And so I interviewed Shane Moe, who is a licensed therapist, and he basically shared what is it that a therapist does and what are ways that this article that Kleinschmidt wrote is misunderstanding what therapists do. I said, when pastors care more about being right than about being helpful, women have to care more about submitting than about healing. Because that was one of the points Moe was making, was about these pastors care more about being right than about being helpful. They're not concerned about really helping women. They're concerned about being right, which requires women to submit to them. And so, that's not where healing can really take place, because women lose their agency in that situation, and they're not being able to, take over their healing and work on themselves, because they have to be primarily concerned about being put in their place of submission rather than being in a space of healing. And so one of the things Kleinschmidt talks about in her piece for the Gospel Coalition is how the church leadership can assess the need for widening the circle of care. And again, sure, there may be a women's director who's involved in that leadership, but that doesn't mean that women are guiding this process, because all the women in that church, the only authority they have is that which has been given to them by the higher authority, which is the male pastor. And so basically, really what's happening is that the pastor is controlling this entire situation. And one of the things that Shane Moe talked about was, in contrast to that, therapists are about empowering people in ways that ultimately reduces their dependence on the therapists. And that's not at all the situation in conservative evangelical churches. They're about ultimate reality is found in your submission to us. So you wonder why women in conservative evangelical churches are starting to go to therapists rather than their pastors. It may be because there are some harmful dynamics going on with their pastors. And it's interesting that the Gospel Coalition is willing to name and observe, hey, a lot of our women are starting to go to therapists rather than to pastors. But the solution then isn't to double down in your theology of authority. It's to maybe self-reflect on some of the harm you're causing and why women would realize that they're not really getting help in your churches. So with that in mind, I come to the second article, and this was titled "Calvinist Pastor Prays for God to Smite the People of Minneapolis." It was written on January 13th for Baptist News Global. And basically, this was about the pastor, Andy Naselli, who prayed in front of his congregation, Christ the King Church, in Minnesota. He said, "Please protect the ICE officers from wicked men and women who are violent lawbreakers." And he has since defended his prayer by focusing on 1 Timothy 2, and where it says to pray for those in authority. But it's interesting that 1 Timothy 2 doesn't ever tell you what to pray for those in authority. he could have prayed for those in authority to repent, to be kind, to stop shooting people in the face and arresting people because they're brown or based on their accent, or using 5-year-old kids as bait in order to lure the mom out of the house so that you can get the mom, or pulling over, off-duty police officers unknowingly and demanding that they show you their papers, and then pulling your gun on them and ripping their phone out of their hands when they feel unsafe. And so, he doesn't pray for that. He prays for people to submit to ICE and for ICE to be protected from the violent people who are lawbreakers. And he asked for God to break Governor Walz and Mayor Frey's teeth, to tear out their fangs, to make them vanish, to cause them to fail, to melt away like a slug, and to become like stillborn children. All of this was based off of an imprecatory prayer in Psalm 58. And again, this is why social location matters. Because in Psalm 58, you're dealing with people who are on the underside of empire. And I know that conservatives don't like to talk about power dynamics, but power dynamics have everything to do with biblical interpretation. Because let's say Babylon, that Israel or Egypt or whoever they were in exile, the Roman Empire, let's say these empires were asking God to break the teeth and tear out the fangs and make to vanish and cause to fail and melt away like a slug and become like stillborn children, the people they were enslaving. That's fundamentally different than the slave asking those same things to God about the people who have taken them from their homes and have enslaved them and imprisoned them and exiled them from their home. And, it's similar to you think about in the United States. Look at the time of the Civil War. If a slave owner was asking God to tear out the fangs of his slaves and to break the teeth of his slaves, it's fundamentally different than a slave asking God to tear out the fangs of the owner who is beating them and raping them. It's fundamentally different than the slave asking God to cause their owner to fail and these people that are enslaving them to fail in their attempt to enslave them. And so social location matters. It matters with your biblical interpretation, and these guys don't care about power dynamics in the Bible. They don't want to name it because it might cause empathy, which they think is toxic. And that's where the harm comes in, because they have territory to protect, because they have the anxieties of the empire rather than the anxieties of those in exile. So basically, in this piece, I wanted to get into the story of Andy Naselli a little bit, because Andy Naselli teaches at John Piper's Bethlehem Seminary, and he was an elder there at the church as well. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Joe Rigney, which was another pastor, he worked at Bethlehem Seminary. He went on a podcast with Doug Wilson, and he started talking about toxic empathy and how empathy is a sin. And so a woman in their church, a couple, Stephen and Jeanette Takata, started to have some questions about this. And in their church, they have a regular quarterly meeting where they can go and present different statements they want the church to make. And she suggested that they make a motion to clarify that the church doesn't necessarily agree with Rigney on being against empathy. Because a lot of the women in the church started to wonder, where are we at in this? And so she wanted some clarification on that. And immediately Naselli gets up and he says, I'm speaking against this motion, and if this motion passes, I will resign as an elder. And then all of a sudden, we have 4 pastors, a staff member, and 4 seminary faculty staff members, and hundreds of church members leaving within 4 months. And there was a lot of hurt that was done, things that Naselli said that were hurtful, that were harmful. And then they had these meetings where they were trying to get these people together. And Naselli said to Takata in the meeting, he said, my intent was not to harm anyone. The Bible distinguishes between unpremeditated accidental acts versus unpremeditated spiteful acts. And whether you feel only sorrow or also seek forgiveness is fully contingent on your heart during the act. He said, it would be so relieving to just say, please forgive me for XYZ, and shake hands or hug and move on. But I'm afraid if I do that at this point, I would be lying to make peace, and I can't do that. So I feel terribly that I hurt you, and I own that, and I regret it, and I'm so sorry. But then he added, I'm not convinced that I have sinned against you, because I have zero ill intent against you in what I've done. And so here you start to see this precision of mental gymnastics that these guys get involved with. Because apparently in Naselli's theology of sin, sin and the need for forgiveness are dependent on the offender's self-awareness of their intentions. So if a pastor doesn't know how he's hurting the women in his church, then he has nothing to ask forgiveness for because he didn't have bad intentions. And this is basically like the posture that these men have toward the women in their church. They lack awareness, and so they have nothing to apologize for. And yet, as I share in the piece, there were actually, at the same time this was going on in the church, there were a dozen seminary students that had accusations against Naselli. And as I shared in that piece, for full disclosure, I used to be a friend of Naselli, and I got along with him very well. But what I started to realize in this is that there's like this peaceful and quiet life that he prayed for that they could have as a church by people submitting to ICE. Like, this is basically the prayer of the empire. It's like the Pax Romana. You have peace through the threat of violence, of breaking the teeth of those who won't submit. And so they're positioning themselves in the posture of praying for the U.S. empire as the U.S. empire, instead of crying out in the cold with the U.S. empire's least of these, referring specifically to the women in their church, the racial and ethnic minorities in their community who are being targeted by ICE. So then we come to this third article that was titled, Let's Talk About How City's Church Treats Women, and this was published on January 21st. And basically, this is this big story that's been in the news. The civil rights lawyer Levy Armstrong confronts the church. She comes in and with a group of, it seems like a couple dozen protesters. Don Lemon was there documenting it. And now white evangelicals everywhere are crying persecution. And this is like, horrible. And they're all of a sudden concerned about kids being traumatized and everything. And immediately when it happened, I said something on Facebook about how I fully support their right to go and tell these pastors off. And I wanted to clarify why I said what I did and kind of my thinking in this, because I know that there are a lot of differences on this topic. There are Baptist News Global writers who are supportive of what she said and did, and there are Baptist News Global writers who are very much against it. In fact, Mark and Ben talked about this on the most recent episode of Stuck in the Middle with You, and they had some similarities and differences. So basically, this is kind of where my thinking was on this. And basically, I'm not saying that everyone needs to start storming white evangelical churches all over the country. I think that there is something unique that is happening in Minnesota right now. There is a level of top-down violence that Minnesotans are experiencing that is unprecedented. And one of the city's church pastors is directing it. One of their sister churches is praying for ICE to break the teeth and cause to be stillborn children those who won't submit to ICE. So there's a massive problem with these pastors. The pastors of this church are an absolute disaster, and they need to be held accountable. So to me, the question is not whether Armstrong and the protesters were right in what they said. The question is whether how they went about it was the best way to get what they wanted to say across. So sure, people can have differences of opinion on that, but what's my role in this? And as someone who is not being directly affected, I don't think it's my place to tell those who are being violently oppressed how they should or should not respond. Like, their neighbors are being kidnapped and murdered. So there's going to be a variety of responses. We've featured pastors on here from Minnesota who are responding by singing in the streets. If you want to sing songs and hold vigils in memory of the people and to call for peace and unity, then I support you in doing that. If there are other people who are responding by blowing whistles to warn their neighbors, and some of these other pastors who sing are also blowing whistles, like if that's how you want to respond, I support you in responding that way. If there are some people who are dancing in a fox mask, or there was one who dressed up like a Viking in a rolling bathtub, or like we saw in Portland, there were people wearing inflatable frog costumes to show just the utter ridiculousness of this whole thing. Like, if that's what you want to do, I support you. As long as people are being nonviolent, I support people who are directly confronting these people who are in charge, and especially white evangelical pastors who are sacralizing and calling for more violence, and who are actually employed by ICE as the people in charge. I understand that storming a church service is probably going to make you look like a bunch of crazy, violent leftists to a lot of people. And perhaps for those who are involved, they might think there are more effective ways for them to influence people outside of their city. But to me, that's a conversation that can be had amongst oppressed people. And I don't really think that it's my place as someone who's outside of the situation to condemn their decisions. Like, I won't do that to Native Americans. I won't do that to Black people or Minnesotans or whoever our white supremacist government decides to target with violent retribution. You know, if a slave back in the day wanted to sing songs in order to process what their slave owner was doing, who am I to tell them no? If a slave wanted to walk into their owner's house and say, hey, let's talk about this because what you're doing to my family is not right. Maybe that would be the best way for them to have a conversation, and maybe it wouldn't, but I don't know that it's my place to condemn them for how they're responding in this moment of absolute violent chaos. And so I'm not going to go out of my way to condemn people for the decisions that they make when they have guns held to their faces, literally. So basically, these pastors, of course, conservative evangelicals are like Albert Mohler and others, Denny Burke, they're calling them words like steadfast, faithful, and bold. And I just think that this is just utterly ridiculous because we need to recognize how these men are not steadfast and faithful and bold, but how they're actually using theology in a way that is harming people and is justifying the violence that is happening. So in that piece, I get into John Piper's glory hierarchy. He talks about how God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And something like that, it feels very freeing for many of us who grew up in fundamentalism to hear our satisfaction being valued rather than dismissed. Because we were always told that your satisfaction doesn't matter. And so John Piper was saying there is no contradiction between your satisfaction and God's glory. Your satisfaction is found in God's glory. And so that sounded freeing to us, but when you take his teaching as a whole, it's a glory hierarchy that requires male headship and female submission. And so it forms its followers to delight in women submitting to men and punishing those who won't, like Renee Good. Piper said, to the degree that a woman's influence over a man, guidance over a man, leadership of a man is personal and directive, it will generally offend a man's good God-given sense of responsibility and leadership, and thus controvert God's created order. He says that if a woman's actual job in the workplace, involves a good deal of directives toward men, they'll need in general, I think, to be non-personal, or men and women won't flourish, I don't think, in the long run, in that relationship without compromising profound biblical and psychological issues. Again, this is going back to that mental gymnastics I talked about that Naselli was doing when it comes to apologizing, but apologizing without asking for forgiveness. Like, they're utilizing these complex formulas that sound, that's interesting. We want to be concerned about psychological issues and flourishing and biblical principles. But in the end, if you actually talk about what's going on in its most stark terms, you're saying that women can't be police officers, women can't be managers in the workplace, women can't serve in the military over people. It's promoting harmful dynamics for women. So I said, I said perhaps this is in part why these men are in such a panic over a black woman like civil rights lawyer Levy Armstrong walking into their church and addressing them so authoritatively about their sin. Women aren't supposed to do that, especially black women, or these men will have psychological issues. I'm not the one saying that. These men are the ones who have said that. And so Andy Naselli and Joe Rigney, who used to be a pastor at Cities Church, went on a podcast with William Wolfe. And you start to see how they're talking about these dynamics. Rigney said, we're trying to build a civilization. Naselli added, we're building and fighting for God's glory. He talked about possibly flipping Minnesota red. Naselli talked about how he's not interested in sharing the gospel with liberal blue elite people, Democrats, but he's sharing the gospel with non-Christian red-leaning people who are like Elon Musk, who have common sense. Like, that's just... it's beyond laughable, but that's what they're doing. They're basically playing the part of a Calvinist God, choosing who they're going to share the gospel with, and it's only people who are MAGA people. And so, one of the ways they're doing this is through the promotion of ICE. Wolfe said ICE might be one of the most critical government agencies in our nation right now. In many ways, they're the heroes. And then he went on to say that Jonathan Ross, the ICE officer who killed Renee Good, is an all-American hero. Naselli talked about how from 2018 to 2021, the Trojan horses for progressive ideology were ethnicity and egalitarianism, or feminism, or the Me Too movement. He said that when Charlie Kirk passed away, he got up in front of his church, and the thing that he decided to talk about was George Floyd. And he said, George Floyd died of a drug overdose. And he said, I said it like that on purpose because that's the truth. And then they started talking about George Floyd's death, and they started talking about how Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, Missouri was justified. Like, why are we responding to the violence in Minneapolis by then just going on this litany of black people who were killed and talking about how their death was justified? And you're saying that the Trojan horse is race and gender. And then they basically went on and they said that people who disagree with them have feminine tendencies. They think like women do with the progressive gaze. So you think about the women in these churches, like, how is that going to make them feel? Well, you give them a director position, you let them write articles that promote your dynamics, and as long as they're, doing that, things can be peaceful. But when things are going harder and they're not going to submit to that dynamic, well, then suddenly we have issues. So John Piper starts talking about divorce. He says, does the Bible allow for divorce in the case of adultery? He said, I don't think so. I don't think the Bible allows divorce and remarriage ever while the spouse is living. That's my radical, crazy, conservative, narrow, hard-nosed, very needed view. And he bases his idea not on the teaching of Jesus, because Jesus actually gave exceptions for a case of adultery. But he said his basis was, he said, look at how many bad marriages there were in the Old Testament and how none of them ended in divorce. So that's your standard? There were bad marriages in the Old Testament, so many of them, and they didn't end in divorce. So therefore, women can't divorce abusive husbands today? He said if it's not requiring her to sin, but simply hurting her, then I think she endures verbal abuse for a season, and she endures perhaps being smacked one night, and then she seeks help from the church. So again, women have to endure the abuse, and when it comes to a point where they can't endure it anymore, even physical abuse, then they go not to the police, but to church pastors, church leadership. Years later, after people were bringing this up, he eventually clarified that women can call the police, but only because God also demands a wife's submission to the authority of civil law. So one of these women is Rachel Curtis, and she went on the Sons of Patriarchy podcast. And she was talking about how her husband ended up getting involved with pornography and lying to a point where the pastors of Cities Church said that they hadn't seen a case with pornography to this level. He actually lost his job over it. Their family ended up in financial ruin. They lost their health insurance, and he lied for 3 years. But to these Cities Church pastors that we're being told are, these persecuted, honorable men, steadfast men, they basically told Rachel Curtis, they said, you can encourage him to lead in this without ever doing it for him. Like they needed her to let him be the one leading her through all of his lying and financial ruin and loss of health insurance and all this kind of stuff that was costing their family. And so they actually went after her. They attacked her. And so after 3 years of this, she decided to leave their church to go to another church that could actually help her. And in doing so, because of that, they decided to publicly excommunicate and shame her, and they affirmed publicly that she was no longer a Christian because she wouldn't submit to them. She said, quote, "The excommunication piece was a public statement to say, if you go against what we say, here's what's going to happen to you. We're going to punish you." But she reminds herself now, God's word nowhere says you're in sin because you changed churches and didn't keep talking to your pastors who spiritually abused you. And so you got the city's church. They claim on their website to be a group of joyful disciples who are worshiping Jesus, loving one another, and seeking the good of the cities. And you see all the coverage of the protest in their church, and they're talking about how we're just there to worship and how these protesters are traumatizing kids, when in reality, they're the ones who are traumatizing the women in their church. They're the ones who are traumatizing their kids. And when they take their power dynamics from within their church walls to the city by going and working for ICE as the director, and then promoting and calling for the breaking of the teeth of those who won't submit to ICE, or those who, won't just go along with the violence that ICE wants to do, then suddenly those people have to be punished. And so she said to Jonathan Parnell, the lead pastor, she said, "You have elevated men above women to an abusive measure, and you publicly spiritually abused me to make an example to other women that if they don't obey you, they too will be punished." And so you wonder why women are leaving these churches to go to therapists. It's because of their entire theology, their gospel of top-down power that is being lived out in top-down power. And so, again, I go back to the protest, and Levi Armstrong addressed their congregation. She said, "How dare you claim to be a pastor of God and you are involved in evil in our community?" What she said was exactly true. And it's exactly what these men needed to hear. And they couldn't take a woman telling them that. And so I'll close with this. I said on Facebook, I said, the reason why white evangelicals lose their minds over a nonviolent interruption of their worship service and don't even blink an eye at a violent invasion of their neighborhoods is that they don't consider their neighbors as sacred. They consider their church building to be sacred. They consider their power dynamics to be sacred. They consider their spot at the top of the highest location one can ascend to, that power in the evangelical church, as John MacArthur said, they consider that sacred. But they don't consider the children in their church to be sacred based on how they traumatize them. They don't consider the women in their church to be sacred because of how they traumatize them. They don't consider themselves to be sacred because in their theology, it's all about putting humans down. God is glorified by putting humans down. And then they don't consider their neighbors to be sacred because they're going and directing all of the violence that ICE is doing. So all of this works together. It all needs to be exposed. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like they're interested in listening. But we'll be here to process it all. The storm's coming this weekend. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like. I may be out of power, so I might have to do Monday's show on my phone and texting it in or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. We'll just have to see how this goes. But I appreciate you listening, and go ahead and like and subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.